Hey everyone, welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. In the Mobile User Acquisition Show, we talk about how to use mobile user acquisition strategies to grow your app quickly and capital efficiently. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is presented by me, Shamant Rao, mobile growth leader and founder and CEO of the mobile growth consulting firm Rocketship HQ. Each episode includes strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition that you can use to unlock tremendous growth for your app in a sustainable and capital efficient manner.
Our guest today is Andy Carvell. Andy is the co-founder of the growth firm Phiture. Before founding Phiture, Andy led the retention team at Soundcloud, where he helped drive some massive experimentation-driven growth. He's also best known for his mobile growth stack, a framework that was built on his 15-year career developing different mobile products. In today's conversation, Andy outlines the impact of privacy changes in iOS 14 upon retention and engagement strategies, especially how the reduced reliance on IDFAs impacts tooling and targeting. He also talks about what to look forward to in iOS 14 and speaks to how successful strategies from his push notification playbook can be directly applicable to increasing IDFA opt-ins.
I'm very excited to welcome Andy Carvell to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shamant. Pleasure to be back.
Yeah, excited to have you again. Definitely, I think your last episode was definitely a favorite, crowd favorite. And of course, you are among the folks that we and a lot of folks in the mobile space look to for a lot of expertise, especially around retention, especially around CRM, and especially about growth holistically. So I'm excited to have you on the show today to talk about some parts of iOS 14 that aren't necessarily front and center just because a lot of iOS 14 conversations tend to be around UA. And I would love to talk to you about aspects that don't directly touch upon UA, but would be just as important and just as critical. So, on the surface, it would appear, look, iOS 14 is about, tracking. It's about attribution, and therefore it impacts acquisition. Therefore, there's no impact on retention strategies whatsoever. So at a high level, how do you see it impacting retention strategies that growth teams or marketing teams might be working on?
So at a high level, the deprecation of IDFA and the sort of increased privacy changes that are coming in with iOS 14 shouldn't be a huge impact to most people doing engagement and retention work, mostly because, and I'll get into maybe some of the detail on this, but most of the tools that they're typically using, analytics tools, customer engagement platforms or CRM, maybe A/B testing frameworks, typically these tools use what are called kind of scoped identifiers to identify users. They would typically have an SDK in the mobile app that would kind of assign an ID to a user the first time that they see that user. And then they'd know that's the same user, when the user's back again. So in the case of analytics, whenever the user is back in the app, they're sending events, they're sending this ID along with it. And the tool or the platform, whether that's internal or a third-party solution, will use this kind of tool-specific ID to identify that user. And there's no reason why those tools should be using the IDFA for that. However, some tools, just the way that they've been engineered, or possibly internally, if they're internal tools, they may have been built using that IDFA, either for whatever engineering sort of decision was behind that. Maybe they thought that this is always going to be there and it's the perfect thing to use to identify the user. I think it would have been a bad engineering choice, actually, particularly in retrospect. But even before iOS 14, we saw people opting out of the IDFA, right? So I think it's not a good universal identifier to be trying to track every user anyway. And certainly now, it's not something you should use to generate those sort of scoped identifiers. But the good news is that it's actually there's lots of other ways that you can kind of create an ID and assign it to a person for a specific use case, like analytics. And these tools, all of the commercial tools are kind of releasing new SDKs if they need to kind of rework anything. So um, that's my sort of long rambling answer for like, high level, it's not going to change that much.
Yeah.
However, if you've got implementations which are using like the IDFA to sort of identify user in these internal scoped um, situations, that needs to be reworked. That would be a pretty serious like bit of homework. And secondly,
Sure.
there are some specific use cases which are going to be affected and are either going to be less impactful or will need a sort of an updated approach, or maybe are just not going to work at all. So we can cover those as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's helpful to start off by mentioning because I think the question mark that many people would have is just like, look, my analytics systems are tracking individual users. Is that not going to work? But
Hmm.
from what you're saying,
No, that'll work.
it will absolutely work because they even right now they have an internal identifier of some sort, and that's how it's going to work.
Exactly, right. So just to put it in a maybe more like kind of just sort of example purposes, like, let's say I'm using amplitude for my analytics, like that's going to have an amplitude ID associated with every user in the system, and that's an internal ID which amplitude uses.
Yeah,
If I'm using, I don't know, Braze for my customer engagement, they'll have a Braze ID attached to all of those. And so each of these individual tools is going to know who these users are and track them. And that's got nothing to do with IDFA. And not much changes there.
right.
Now, typically you might also want to kind of to create a broader understanding of the identity of this user. You might pass into some of these tools what's called an external ID or a kind of a universal identifier to say, well, this is actually user X. This is Andy Carvell. In which case, you can pass in that information and associate it with that user and say, hey, this amplitude ID number 54 is Andy Carvell. Now, how you're identifying Andy Carvell is kind of up to you in your system as a publisher. And some publishers will have used like maybe IDFA for that. It's also not a great idea for that because it's not a cross-platform identifier. Some systems would use, for example, an email address as a unique identifier, or a phone number, or just a generated unique number that's not the IDFA. In which case, again, they're kind of safe.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Yeah. And do you think that could be problematic because Apple says no tracking whatsoever? I don't think Apple says, oh, no tracking using IDFA.
No, I don't think it's going to be a problem to be storing email addresses and things like that, as long
Yeah.
as you're clear. You still got to be in compliance with all the necessary privacy regulation like GDPR. If you're going to use an email address to track people in various tools and things, then you need to be
Sure.
explicit about that in your privacy policy.
Sure. 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 And what happens to deep links and deferred deep links? How does growth via virality or referrals change as a result of this?
Yeah, that's going to change for sure. But maybe not drastically, right? So regular deep linking, right, which we would use actually all the time with things like push notifications and in-app messages, and yeah, possibly emails to link people into a specific part of the app, a specific screen or feature, kind of like a web hyperlink. You get people to where you want to put them rather than just opening the app. These would typically be implemented. These are called implemented with like a direct deep link. So basically a standard URI schema, a universal link, or like key value pairs, which tell the application can parse and interpret and direct the user appropriately when the app is opened. Now that won't change. None of that is kind of affected by iOS 14. What would change is this thing called deferred deep linking, which is what you're referring to here with like virality, right? Like if you actually
Yeah.
send a link and you don't know who's going to click on that link. Maybe let's say I used to work at Soundcloud, right? So Soundcloud used to use these a lot. You'd send a link to somebody for sharing a track that you like, post it on, I don't know, Facebook, or you send it by email or WhatsApp. You don't know if the person who's clicking on that is going to have the app installed or not. Like, so the ideal flow and what deferred deep linking opens up is like that you can have, if they've got the app installed, it's going to bring them into the app, and it's working essentially to re-engage that user from the publisher perspective. And if they don't have the app, it'll take them to the App Store, and they'll download it and install it. And if they install that, the deep link will then kick in and take them to where, to the original track that you shared. And that's like, it's almost like magic, right? That's a beautiful piece of technology, which will be less effective because it's now going to have to rely on what they call non-deterministic or probabilistic methods. So in other words, fingerprinting. So Branch seem to, be fairly buoyant that they have a solution for this that's not using IDFA. There are ways to do this, and I think for things like content shares or kind of really non-critical stuff where it's kind of, if it doesn't get an exact match and it has to fall back to a generic experience like just opening the app, it's not really the end of the world. Even for invites into to, if you like, I'm inviting my friends, if it can't make that match, your app is going to need to basically fall back to a generic experience. Now that's fine, I think, for most use cases actually, and most virality use cases will still work. But if you've got something like an auto login, a link that fires like up, that logs people in automatically or automatically creates them an account, that's really kind of requiring to know that this is the same user who clicked on the link. Or let's say you're sending someone a sort of a fairly high value referral incentive, like a $50 voucher or something, and that's kind of embedded in this deferred deep link. Then you want to be really sure that you've got an exact match, and you need a deterministic method, and that's not going to be available.
Yeah, and I think that is a very important thing that gets impacted. So I understand this becomes problematic just because with the referral flow, you're essentially saying this user came exactly via this link, therefore I will give them $50. And
Exactly.
of course, you can't pinpoint as to where a user is coming from under the new policy.
Right. I mean, in many cases, the probabilistic match will work, but it's not going to be 100% of the time.
Yeah. And if you're doing that probabilistic attribution via fingerprinting, is that not out of bounds of Apple's privacy laws?
Well, seems to be a bit of a gray area. I mean, I'm not working exactly on that side of things on the tool space, but I see tools providers like Branch, for example, saying that they're going to use fingerprinting type techniques. So they obviously seem to think that that's possible. I'm kind of working on the assumption that they've done their homework there, and but it could be that they're being optimistic, and it could be that they get slapped down by Apple. I think there's still a lot of gray areas still at the moment. So and if they're not even able to use these non-deterministic methods, then then really that channel is going to be massively affected for virality.
Yeah, because if you can't even do probabilistically, like you said, you're giving users a generic experience, and that will erode a lot of the metrics and the efficiency of those channels significantly, I would guess.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. And something else that's very critical to the performance of a lot of CRM campaigns and retention initiatives is to be able to segment users, like being high value users or users who consume specific content versus the rest.
Mm-hmm.
So does that get impacted at all as a result of the new privacy changes, or how do you see that at all?
So some quite specific segmentation approaches are going to be challenged. Like in general, segmenting users based on behavior is not going to change because you're going to do your segmentation in your analytics platform or your CRM platform, and these will have a way of identifying users with these internal IDs, as I mentioned. So you still be able to segment users based on their behavior, based on events that you're tracking within your ecosystem, your app, and the tools that you're using. It's really like crossing, like the challenge, or what's going away is that ability to segment users across multiple apps and to find them like in other places. However, right, there are some caveats to that. Geofencing is not going to be possible from what I can see, at least not without getting explicit exact exact location targeting permissions, which again is going to be a lot tougher because you have to ask for those explicitly. And so I've seen like some of the customer engagement platforms are basically pulling out from iOS like the ability to geofence because you're going to have instead this like very kind of vague location-based targeting, which is going to be a lot less specific. Now, from a like human point of view, I think that's great. Like, I don't really want every company on the planet being able to target me on my precise location to a few meters. So I think it's great from a privacy perspective. I'm all for it. If I was, doing location-based marketing, however, this would present some challenges to me. And we have, we work with clients on, location-based solutions where, some of these are going to have to adapt. Now, if it's like broad location-based to, a state level, for example, or a county level, or maybe even a bit closer. But I've heard it can be sort of several miles out, from your exact location. So if you're doing things like, predict, like we at Phiture, we did like implemented a nice kind of weather location-based system that sort of pulled like weather data from like where the user was approximately, and give them sort of weather personalized push notifications with a client of ours. That's going to work just fine because like weather doesn't change within a couple of miles, not typically. But another example would be that Burger King ran this awesome campaign where they were geofencing users who went within a couple of 100 meters of a McDonald's store and offered them a free Whopper or like 1 cent Whopper or something. You won't be able to do stuff like that anymore.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that sort of laser targeting just becomes impossible at the location level,
Hmm.
right? Yeah. And another component of the growth stack of a lot of marketers is like CDPs. And many apps and marketers basically use them to aggregate the data, use this data for retention. How this, how are CDPs positioned post iOS 14? How does their usage change?
Yeah, so I think CDPs definitely have some challenges because they work as a kind of a central hub and then multiplex data to like
Sure.
federate data to a lot of other integrations, right? And so
Mm.
it's not so much from what I can see, and I do need to chat more with some of the CDPs to get a deeper perspective on this. But from what I can see, that they're actually pretty well set up. They've kind of always been thinking about things like privacy actually for quite a long time, and actually they help to manage that process and like help to manage identity across multiple platforms. So they've been thinking about this a lot longer than everybody else. I've seen that, for example, mParticles no longer collecting IDFA by default and requires the app to explicitly send that if they want to collect that from users. And let's come back to that, by the way, this fact that you will still be able to collect IDFA if you ask it a
Yeah,
permission. So
yeah,
let's come back to the permissioning aspect, like before I forget it. But um, but yeah, so I think like in principle, like you'll still be able to use these CDPs. They're going to be compliant, and they're putting on a brave face and saying, well, actually most of our integrations are not going to be affected by this. This is the bit which I'm not so clear on. Is like I guess it depends on your individual setup and where you're federating that data and how you're using it as to how much you're going to be affected. I imagine some folks will be highly affected and find that their current CDP configuration is going to be considerably less useful, whereas others probably will have very little impact. It really depends on the use cases. If they're federating stuff out to then like retarget people on programmatic ad networks,
sure,
that's a use case which is going to be gone.
sure.
And if that's your main use case for your CDP, then yeah, then clearly there's an issue there also for the CDP. But I
Sure.
think one of their advantages as platforms, the CDPs I'm talking about, is that they are so multifaceted and they have like very broad range of integrations across many different kind of types of use cases. So I think their whole kind of purpose is to make you more adaptable and more flexible. So
Sure.
I think they'll be fine. And I think actually if you've got a CDP, you're actually probably well positioned to adapt to these changes, even if you do need to sort of change up your current setup.
Got it. So would it be fair to say you talked about scope identifiers earlier? You probably have scoped identifiers in your analytics, in your PN system, in your email system. So because the CDP is basically collecting a lot of these scoped identifiers, it's aggregating these rather than anything that's not idea. As long as it's collecting a lot of non-IDFA identifiers, it's good. But if IDFAs are a part of that mix, then it becomes challenging. Would that be a fair understanding of how things stand?
That's my current understanding. I'm not sure if it's the correct one, to be honest, but yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is also my understanding. So yeah, that's kind of how I see that it works. Like everyone's trying to avoid the IDFA like the plague now, and if they were relying on it, they're looking for other deterministic solutions to identify people. Yeah, one thing which I didn't touch on yet, apart from the permissioning, is I think what this whole all these changes actually kind of, I think the one of the big kind of themes is that it's going to push more account creation activity within apps. Like I think there's going to be less anonymous usage kind of experiences designed and implemented, and a lot more kind of push towards getting users to sort of explicitly sign up for accounts and contribute, as I said, like with like the appropriate permissions, the personal information that they're willing to share, which allows you to build a unique identifier which you can use universally and also cross-platform, which then potentially you can even then use for retargeting these users. I've heard that Facebook is going to allow retargeting or lookalikes even to be built off email addresses or phone numbers if those things are collected explicitly with permission. So yeah, I think there's going to be a big move
Sure.
towards like more logged in experiences.
Yeah. Right. And that's in some ways getting users to opt into giving their info in other ways,
Exactly.
right? So that you can essentially target them elsewhere.
Hmm.
And of course, there's more to iOS 14 than just the privacy changes. So what are some of the new features within iOS 14 that you're most excited about and that could be most impactful for retention strategies for apps?
So I actually like for retention strategies for apps. I think one of the big ones is the widgets. Actually, the widgets are really cool. They put a lot of work into like upgrading those, making those look a lot more sexy and hopefully a lot more usable. I think it's a bit too early to say how that's going to affect engagement and retention, and obviously it's also very app specific. But it gives like an
What's a widget? Sorry, what's a widget?
so it's like something that as you can sit on your home screen, which provides some like a view into your app. You can have like, for example, I don't know, stats on there, things like this from I don't know if you're a fitness app or something like this. You could have your kind of how much you've been running over the last few days or something like this. So like the widgets have existed actually for a long time, particularly on Android. They've been there since like a long time ago, home screen widgets. But I really like the new implementation on iOS 14. I think iOS is doing it a nice way, and I think that I've already seen some nice implementations from apps that have got that out for launch. But yeah, in terms of the other stuff, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of features in iOS 14. I'm still kind of exploring some of them, but I actually like some of the privacy features. Like there's this little orange dot thing, which shows up if an app either is currently using your camera or microphone or has been using it recently. I think it's like stuff like this that kind of they're really kind of trying to put the user a lot more in control and give them more transparency on what their phone is doing and what the apps are doing. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, that also underscores that definitely for marketers, the IDFA privacy changes have been top of mind, but definitely there's a lot more that's coming from that could be exciting for consumers and for privacy broadly just as well. Uh, and as you have expressed, Andy, I think just from a retention perspective for users, for apps managing their CRM, the impact is going to be less dramatic than it is for on the acquisition side.
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, just before I forget, let's just quickly revisit the permissioning thing. So, like,
Yeah.
just as another caveat to all of that, like, I've said that there are certain things which are going to be totally impossible. Now, they won't be impossible, as far as I understand it. They won't be impossible for users who have explicitly consented for you to use their IDFA. Now it's a pretty tough dialogue, which Apple shows up. That's sort of, hey, do you want to let this app track you across other apps and things like this? So it's a pretty scary dialogue. But I think if you really have use cases which really need people to contribute that permission, and maybe it's like you've got some users who are going to be super high value to retarget on other networks or whatever, and you can get them to to give that permission by kind of optimizing the hell out of your pre-permission dialogues using in-app messages, for example, or directing loyal users to go back to settings and turn that IDFA sharing back on, which we call a win back. These are techniques which actually we've used a long time very effectively and helped our customers to implement these kind of flows for push notification opt-in. So like there definitely are ways to increase opt-in rates for stuff, and apps will have to work a lot harder to get people to opt in for IDFA, I think, than push, but it'll still be possible for at least some segment of the user base.
Yeah, definitely. I think prior to iOS 14, I think push opt-in rate optimization, I think that was underappreciated by a lot of folks, but I think that could have been that can be enormously impactful. And I expect from what you're saying that getting the iOS opt-in rate up, the IDFA opt-in rate up, is going to be a very, very important lever that a lot of apps will have to pull.
Yeah. I mean, if they can't find a better way to do things than using IDFA, I think a lot of apps will just abandon it. But those that are really, really like reliant on it and finding it actually incredibly valuable to their business, and I think they're gonna at least probably have a go at like increasing that opt-in rate. And I can tell you from experience, from actually years of working with apps to improve push notification opt-in and email opt-in, there are a lot of techniques there, and you can always optimize it. You can always get some uplift from whatever the baseline is.
Yeah, what might be some of the things that strategies they could borrow from the push notification or email opt-in playbook that you think could be applicable for improving opt-in rates here?
So there's a couple of sort of textbook techniques, right? One is to ask people to opt in for stuff like this at a sort of a happy moment, when they've just had a really good experience. You can kind of maybe infer that they're really loving the app, and hence it's a great time to ask them. Now, that works to some extent, but actually what I found to work better is first of all using a pre-permission. It's basically an in-app dialogue which you control as a marketer or as a developer, where you ask the user, hey, would you like to share, to opt in for this? And you can test, of course, with that different benefits and things to optimize the click rate. And when people say yes, then you show them the system dialog, which Apple only allows you to show once. If they say no, you can try again, a bit later. You can try again at a happy moment, or at, with different benefits that you're offering. So you can keep trying, and then you're sort of saving that one-shot system dialog for a time when you really think that the user's going to say yes. So that's very effective. That's what we call pre-permissioning. And then on the other side, what I call win-backs, is going back to your loyal users, the users who are still in the app after 2 or 3 weeks, but they're opted out. And you ask them, hey, like actually now would you consider opting in? And we can take you straight over to settings, and you can actually like link them straight over to the settings menu and have them turn it back on. That's actually crazy effective.
Yeah. You would think that has a lot of friction, but it sounds like if you show that to sufficiently loyal users, you can still get them to opt back in.
Yeah, you can, at least with push. Not all of them will opt back in, but very few of them will churn just because you ask them.
Right. So, at the very least, you want them to not churn. And at the best case scenario is they opt in, worst case, they continue playing.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And certainly I think there's quite a bit, as you said, that's somewhat textbook stuff for PMs and emails, but can definitely be applied directly to IDFA opt-ins. Andy, I think this has been incredibly instructive. I think both to also know and understand what the lay of the land looks like on the retention front, and also to understand the implications of all of this on the holistic growth strategies for many apps. This has been great. This is perhaps a good place for us to start to wrap up. But before we do that, can you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm co-founder at Phiture. We're a mobile growth consultancy based in Berlin, but working with B2C apps worldwide. We help apps to grow, and you can find out all about Phiture and get in touch with us there at www.phiture, we spell it with a ph, phiture.com. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, Andy Carvell with two L's.
Excellent, excellent. We will link to all of that in the show notes. But for now, this is perhaps a good place for us to wrap. Thank you so much for being on the show, Andy.
Thank you, Shamant. Pleasure, as always.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog.